inspiration, brave action, and heartwarming journeys. This is what the Louise H. Reed Show brings you. Now, here's your host, Louise H. Reed.
Hello, everyone. And thank you for joining me this wonderful Tuesday. I am your host, Louise H. Reed, with listeners in over 145 countries and with millions of iTunes downloads each month. I am the fortunate host here every Tuesday at this time to explore the incredible journeys of amazing people who have truly embraced the notion of taking brave, bold action in pursuit of their dreams and goals. I'd like to remind everyone listening that you can find information about my show and my great guests at louisehreed.com. Now, before we hear from today's guest, let me share a little bit of information about her. Robin Blackburn McBride is an author and coach in human potential. Her self-help ebook, Birdlight, Freeing Your Authentic Creativity, became an Amazon bestseller in 2016 and has since been released in paperback and as an audiobook. That in and of itself is pretty cool, but listen to this. So for 20 years, Robin was a full-time teacher in Toronto. In 2002, a collection of her poetry was published. She's also worked as a stage actress and holds degrees in drama, English, and education from the University of Toronto. And now, as if that wasn't enough, she has recently written her first novel, which I'm really excited to talk about today, called The Shining Fragments. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Thank you so much, Louise. It's just a real pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled that we're speaking again.
Yes, thank you. As
always lovely.
As am I. You know that I'm really passionate about sharing people's stories and their journey. And I find even just reading that brief bio gives a little bit of insight into some of the twists and turns that your life has taken, obviously by choice. And this is what I find one of the things I find so interesting about you. So let's sort of rewind the clock a little bit. And even just so, for 20 years, you said you were a full-time teacher. Mm-hmm. So what happened at the end of 20 years of teaching?
Wow. Well, let me just say the dots, we're all familiar with that expression. The dots connect in hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20, so it all looks like it makes sense, right? It wasn't as though I knew that at that 20-year mark that would be it. We would have completion of that chapter. No, it didn't feel like that at all. It so happened that I was at that point in time when I made a career change, and lots of things came together in that moment of my life, which seems like quite a while ago now. It actually wasn't that long ago. It was only several years ago. But yeah. I think, where do you want me to begin?
Well, I know.
How would you like me to enter the story? Because there are a number of doors.
Well, that's what I find so fascinating about these kinds of journeys. And what I really like already about what you said, and I will answer your question more directly in a moment, but is that it is a culmination of events that often lead us to a point in our life where we're kind of at a crossroads. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sometimes a crossroads is a really positive place to be. And sometimes one may feel, and this was my case, when I experienced a significant crossroads in my life, it was because a bunch of really shitty things had happened. And I was like, okay, I've got some choices to make here. I want to be in the driver's seat. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to have to really, really have some tough talk with myself and really do some reflecting to figure out what really is the next best step. And so with that said, I'm really curious to kind of understand. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about this crossroads. I'm using the word crossroads. I don't know if for you it was a crossroads, but kind of what that point was like, and then how you figured out what the next best step was for you.
Right. Well, then I'm going to go back farther in time.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to many years ago when I was a very young woman in my early 20s. And again, remembering that everything connects in hindsight, it all looks very clear. At that time, looking ahead, my life was theater.
Right.
I had always been a stage kid. I had always been someone who found home in theater and with actors. And I loved two things passionately. Actually, I loved a number of things, but two really stood out for me when I was a very young woman. One was writing and the other was live performance. And so for me, I thought, well, that's it. That's what it's going to be. I did the degree in drama and I went out into the wide world. And something happened in a really short period of time that just absolutely shocked me. And I experienced what it is to give up on a dream.
Mm.
And I was reflecting this morning on what I would share in this talk with you. There's that very beautiful expression that the crack is where the light gets in. You know, I felt broken. A part of me was almost in disbelief that I was giving up on it. And I often tell this story or versions of this story depending on what the situation is, but often when I'm with a group speaking, because obviously it's not just my story, it's potentially all of our stories, right? Because it's that moment where you realize things have turned out differently. and the thing was, at that time in my life, Louise, and you'll as a coach appreciate this, I had really pretty good skill teachers. I mean, I had people who were very fine teachers of performance. I had passion, I had potential. All of those things were in place. What I did not have was a skill set for navigating the obstacles.
Got it.
So for me, I call that spiritual muscle. Now, I had on one level, yes, spiritual muscle, but I didn't have a refined toolkit for what to do when people said no. So I made a number of choices that seemed very practical. And honestly, you know, on the surface of things, if you'd looked at me, you would have said, this girl has no problem. You know, I got into teaching school. I did another degree in English. I hung out with poets for a couple of years while my little baby girl, was sleeping at night. I would be up writing essays and reading the romantic poets. And, I had this amazing experience. And on top of it, I was offered a job very early in the game at a very, very beautiful, fine school in Canada. Yeah. So on the surface, it just looked like everything had come together. And for many reasons, I believe it had come together, except that there was a piece of me, Louise, that got left behind. Mm-hmm. And that is the piece that so interests me in all of us. You know, those pieces of us that we came into this life with so many of us have that innate sense that we came here for a particular mission. We came here with a particular constellation of gifts, of passions, desires. And it's that sense of we need to honor that. Part of me had come here to serve and had been left behind. And that was a source of pain in my life. Even though so many things worked well, deep down, there was unfinished business. And so coming up to the end of the 20 years, I guess really that was about unfinished business. And I can tell you more about writing, whatever you'd like me to talk about. Yeah, because writing was my key. Following my dream really became my key.
I think it's just really, I wanted to actually just say thank you for sharing that, because I think in this, and I've mentioned this to you, I believe once before, that in this really connected, hyper-connected world, online world, we are less connected as humans than ever before. Mm. And my regular listeners will have heard me say that before, because it is a true belief of mine. And that is why I love when people like you come onto the show and are just so willing to share. I think there's a lot of people who can relate to that concept of things look perfect on the outside, and then on the inside, we can't explain why we might be feeling pain, loss, hurt, because we did everything that we were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really appreciate, I wanted to say thank you for sharing that. And I do want to explore your writing. I also want to say I love even just listening to you speak. You could just go on a 1 hour monologue, because you speak
I
with
won't.
well, you know what? This is my show, so I probably won't let you. But anyway,
Good.
but you have a poetic way that you actually speak.
Oh.
And it's quite interesting. So I wanted to ask you before I even forget this. Are you the voice of your ebook?
Yes, I am.
Of your audiobook? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm glad.
Oh, thank you.
And I would love to actually listen to that, because your telling of a story through what we've heard so far in this interview is very, the way that you string words together and your tone, I guess that's your theatre background, is very interesting and unique.
Thank you.
So you felt this thing.
Well,
what did how did you start to uncover that, and how will you explore, how did you explore that?
mm-hmm. Well, what I noticed early in the game with me was certain parts of my life were very solid. I mean, professionally, always very solid in the workplace, always devoted to working with students, with colleagues. I mean, that part was really in many ways my rock. And so I'm very grateful for that, very grateful. But as I mentioned, part of me had felt left behind in my late 20s. Now, when I look back, I see, yes, there were signs. I mean, we live, to quote Robert Moss for a moment, we live in the speaking land. Well, he's quoting Aboriginal teachers in Australia who look upon this world as a world that is talking to us all the time. And I very much believe that in synchronicities and signs. And so things were showing up in my life indicating that I needed to pay more attention. So in my health domain, in my late 20s, some issues showed up that really got my attention that I had to notice and deal with. My first marriage ended, and that was a surprise to me. Although it makes sense on so many levels, and we were blessed to have a beautiful child together. It's time. It had served its purpose. I like to look at it that way. Yeah, we had a beautiful connection, and it served its purpose. Mm-hmm. And nevertheless, if we had zoomed in to, I guess maybe age 34, wow, that's really in the rear view mirror now. But if we had zoomed in there, you would have seen a woman who felt like her life was falling apart and in chaos behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And at that point in my life, I brought out my first book. So that experience of bringing out a book that happened a long time ago with me. And that was my poetry book in green. And in that book, I really feel like I ride the chaos in many of those poems and investigate it and probe it and love it. And, that, what did Dylan Thomas call it? The holy darkness, right? I mean, that was a really important piece for me to bring that into the light. At that time, I still had years to go in teaching. And I reached a point of, I will call it not so much a breaking down as a breaking open. And at that point in my mid to late 30s, I think it was around 36, it became clear to me that some changes had to be made if I was going to have different results. Now, that was years before I got into coaching, but that much became clear. It became clear to me that fulfillment was actually a decision, that it was actually a choice, not just something that some lucky people got to experience. Right. And I owned that. And what happened in that period was that a novel started coming to me. And that was in it's 2018 now. That was in 2002.
That's when it started brewing in you. Yeah.
It really did. It came, I would say, in the way I love stories to come. It found me. I seemed to be at the right frequency for it, and it found me. And so the main character of my novel, Joseph Conlon, really was a presence with me at that point in my life. And I began to become very curious about who he was, what his story was, to the point that in 2003, I went to Northern Ireland. Now, I was teaching the whole way along. And so let me go back to your original question, how did this start? What I discovered, first of all, let me say, trust your dream. I just want to say this to anyone listening right now. Trust your dream. Trust those hunches. I trusted that I could bring a book into the world. I didn't care how long it took me. But what I learned in that moment was that I could trust myself to vote for it, and I could figure out a way of doing it in baby steps. So my mentor, Mary Morrissey, often uses the term baby steps, and I really embrace that. In that time, it would not have been the right move to leave my work and go on this journey. And I was raising a daughter. My daughter was 12. That was the moment I was in. But I honored the calling by finding moments in my year when I could really go deep into this story. So in 2003, I went to Northern Ireland. I like to say I traveled by synchronicity to Northern Ireland. I didn't have any idea how I was going to make that trip come together. At that time, I was a single mom and hadn't been across the ocean since I was a child. It came together very beautifully once I set my vision on it. Yeah.
Mm.
I do want to share this, that I had been in Toronto, I had been writing pieces of this story. The story was originally going to be in one book, 3 different time periods. It was going to be what we call a time slip genre piece, going back and forth through time. And it just became very clear early on, maybe into the second year of it, that it couldn't be that. It was just too unwieldy. So I broke the story into three stories, 3 different generations. And actually the book that's coming out is story 1. It's the coming to Canada story. It's Joseph's story of coming from what's now called Northern Ireland. I mean, when he came in 1882, it was Ireland. And so, yeah, I'll just pause there because I've totally derailed myself.
Well, and
bring me back on track.
What I love is I love these. We're having coffee together.
Yeah,
right? We're having coffee together, and I love how we can just explore the things that come to us the things that come to you that you feel are compelling and you wish to share. I have lots of questions, so no need to worry about that. So you talked about how his story came to you. I know what that means, but I would honestly say that it probably wasn't until I was about 40 years old that I started to open myself up to things that I couldn't, open my mind and my heart up to things that were not physically in front of me. So for those people listening right now who might not really know what you mean, that they may hear these kinds of phrases, oh, it just came to me. Talk to me about how that actually works. So we're probably talking a little bit about some of your coaching stuff here as well.
Well, yes. I mean, one of the things I love about my work in the world is I get to connect with you. I get to connect with people who come in to work with me on well, frankly, the level of story, because really what coaching is an honoring and realizing of desired story. And so when somebody, we all have a calling. It's different in each one of us. We're unique beings. I mean, we're all connected, but we're absolutely unique. And so for me, to answer your question, the writing process for me has always been a way of feeling home. And I'm comfortable with theater way back there now. I don't have that same burning desire that I did as a young person. Writing, I believe, is my home base, and I'll tell you why and what it looks like for me when I say that a character comes to me. Yeah. That we're all very familiar with living in the 3-dimensional world. And we're very familiar also with that 4th dimension that we call time. And we're so conditioned that those are the normal things, that this is our normal experience. Well, I believe very strongly that we also live on another plane at the same time. We're living in another dimension too. They're not happening separately. We often are forgetting that. So when I write, and please interrupt me if any of this doesn't make sense.
Oh, it's making sense.
It's making sense. Okay,
it's
good.
Making sense.
So when I write, what that allows me to do is go home to that other dimension.
So you can tap into that.
Absolutely. And so when a character comes through, it's real. It's a voice. It's an invitation to a journey. And so now, not everybody I work with is particularly oriented that way and thinking that way, and that's okay. You know, one of the things that I do enjoy is actually connecting in whatever way someone relates to, so that we can have that beautiful way forward and help them feel fulfilled, right? And do the things that allow that to happen.
Would you call that other dimension perhaps intuition, or is that a little bit different?
Well, you know, it's really interesting. I was just listening to Jean Houston on this. Jean Houston is an icon of the 20th and 21st century. She's prolific on this, and she talks about how, you know, there are theories now that there are so many dimensions. I don't know if it was Jean or someone else saying recently, you know, maybe scientists postulate there are certain branches of science postulate that there might be 47. I'm going to lump them all together, and I'm just going to say, let's just imagine for a moment. Let's use that beautiful faculty of imagination and imagine it as this, we'll call it the spiritual plane. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about
beyond our physical presence.
Beyond our physical, yes. And so, you know, our five senses, we know, are limited. We know. We forget all the time that we're not actually sensing everything that's happening around us. So when we find ways of connecting absolutely with inner guidance, with intuition, that's obviously a really important key piece of this. And I love that, because for me, that's when I really get to, I feel that that's when a part of my soul gets to play full out and do its thing. And then I can suit up and be on a call. I can go and give a talk, you know, in somebody's place of business. I can be in the world.
Yeah.
If I have that harmony of being able to also go to that other place. To me, that is very much a part of being a whole human.
I think it's interesting what you're saying. The first exposure I had to even that realm of possibility. Do you remember the movie Sixth Sense?
Yes.
Time ago now.
Yes.
And all I can remember is that little boy saying, "I see dead people." And so, not meaning to sort of trivialize what you're saying, but that was the first time I was kind of like, "Oh, what is this?" Even though that was all, you know, that was a Hollywood film. It did open my mind to the idea of, is there another sort of sense there? So let's go back now. I want to go back into your story a little bit. So you went to Ireland. What made you decide to listen to that part of yourself, to trust your dream? And I'm asking specifically because I know everyone, regardless of whether their dream is to go to Ireland to follow to follow a dream and write a story that is coming to them, or it's another decision that they're grappling with. We all get to a point in our life where we have to take a leap of faith.
Yes. You used a term early in our conversation. You used the term crossroads. And I want to come back to that, because this is such an important point for all of us. It's okay to be at a crossroads, but we don't want to hang out there.
Right.
Because what happens when we hang out there is we leak energy. And for many of us, there are times in our lives where we may discover that that's been happening for 5 years. And it has to symptomize. Somehow it has to symptomize. And so when you recognize that you're at a crossroads, it's very important to decide and move forward and feel into that intuition. I use a technique in journaling. In fact, I just made a little video about this where I do a core dialogue journal. I'll go in and I'll have a dialogue on the page with my higher self. You know, I can call it that. I can give it a name and call it a guide. I don't even have to understand how it works in order to have the conversation, and through that, in my journal, gain clarity on what the next step is. So for me, in that moment of my life, when I said, you know what, I'm doing this thing, I was very fortunate on one level. I do believe we make our luck. I was a teacher, so I had stretches of time in the year when I could write, and summer was one of them. So I said, yes, I'm doing it. I'm going to, you know, some people would have thought, oh, do I commit weeks to this? I mean, what if it turns out that it comes to nothing, and then I'll look back and I'll have wasted the summer? Well, you know, I really recommend not making agreement with that kind of thinking, focusing on the thing that you're calling in. Yeah. So by the time the trip came up, I was invited to attend a conference in Switzerland, and the admin team at my school said, you know, we'll fly you there. We'll train you for a week. And I was so grateful. I said yes, because I could fly back out of Northern Ireland. I didn't have to leave from Switzerland. So that's how that particular piece came together. But I had made some fairly significant changes to the way I was living my life at that moment in time. And that had been the result of that breaking open moment. So I had already been doing things differently when I received the call to go on this journey with this book. And I think that I had come so far with that, and I had been receiving support with that. I mean, I want to say this to you, to anyone listening right now, that it's so important to have support through these kinds of changes. And so I did have that. It was very easy to say yes to it, actually, Louise. And you know, after all, I wasn't blowing everything up to do it. I was simply taking a risk at that time to carve out these times and vote for it. Yeah. Later in the process, several years later in the process, I brought in a reader, somebody who's very special to me. Mary Jo Morris came in, and she agreed to be my first reader on this novel. And for, I think, 3 years, she was the only other person on the planet who was reading this story. Yeah, it was very special. She gave me a lot of guidance. And then, of course, you reach a certain point where other people, you begin to make connections and other people get interested. By the time I had reached that year 20 in the teaching, I was feeling really beautifully complete with it. Honestly, that was where I was at with it. I didn't have any unfinished business. I had pretty much taught at every level I wanted to teach at. I knew I didn't want to be an administrator. I really respected my administrators, but it just wasn't my calling. I loved their leadership. I was called to lead in a different way. There was a whole lot of question marks around what that exactly would look like. I just knew I needed to bring the book into form. And actually, when I said yes to making the career change, that was a whole different moment. And that was 10 years.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how you came to that. And then I want to hear a little bit more about the book. But this journey for the book coming together, I think, is a big part of your story behind it. I think it's just such a compelling part as it relates to your novel.
Oh, thank you.
So you just said that, you know, that in and of itself, when you made that decision to leave teaching, you know, that's another crossroads that you're at.
It wasn't easy. It was clear to me, but it was not easy. I want to make that much clear. It was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. Because I had interest in the book. The manuscript was to a point, back in 2012, actually, it was to a point where I could put it in the hands of an agent. And, you know, again, I think of literary angels around me at that point. I write about them in the acknowledgments at the back of the book. I mean, there were people who showed up and really helped. And one of them was Wei-Sin Choi, a beautiful writer, a beautiful man. And he made a connection for me. And this book was getting green lights. And at that point, I thought, okay, this is the way it's going to be. I'm going to have an offer and it'll all make sense. And when I leave, when I give notice, I'll be, you know, it'll all make sense.
Yeah.
Well, what happened was I was sitting in my classroom a number of times, you know, with the students who I was serving. It's funny, I always called them my clients. I'd say that to my husband now, you know, I'd come home, he'd say, how are the clients today? Anyway, had no idea I'd be coaching. But I would receive these rejections over email. I'd be on the carpet with my grade 7s. We'd be doing stuff on the rug, and I'd come over to my desk. I'd open my email for a moment and see a rejection from a major Canadian publisher. You know, a day later, another rejection. The first round when it went out, it was rejected everywhere. And so this was the most difficult thing for my ego. because if one of them had said yes, it would have made sense to that tidy, logical part of the brain. And they were not meant to say yes. And
I need to interrupt you here, though, because this is so interesting about your story is that you were tested again with that spiritual muscle that you lacked years ago when you were being rejected in acting. How is it different this time?
Well, don't think that the irony was lost on me. Because it was not. Yeah. So, well, what happened was, I remember very clearly I was in, again, I don't live in Toronto now, but I certainly did then. And I was down in the Castle Frank subway station waiting for the train home. And I just thought, like, what is this? Do I just stop? The agent I was working with had said to me, you know, I think you should rework it. I think you should work with an editor. And I kept thinking, I can't do it. I cannot. Okay, so this is what the novel looks like now.
Yeah.
The manuscript was actually twice this length.
Wow.
I said to myself, there's no way I can do this on a summer holiday. And the thought of stretching it out on 3, like, I knew I was actually just about at that point on the receiving end of coaching, and that really helped. But in that moment, I just knew that it couldn't be a summer holiday. I came home. I remember very distinctly standing on that streetcar track and deciding for it. And the decision was, I'm doing it anyway. I feel complete in this job. I feel finished. Thank you. And I'm doing it anyway, with no guarantee, no yeses, a book that would have to be rewritten. I remember speaking with my head of school. We had at that time 2 wonderful women who were, you know, both people I would speak to when it in matters such as I would like to stop teaching, and I saw them both separately. And I just remember, I want to say this from my heart, that both of those women were amazing with me and celebrated me. They didn't really know what was going on with the novel. I wasn't talking to anybody about it at that point. They just knew that I was ready to make a change, and they celebrated me and celebrated that I would be leaving the job 10 years early, because if I had continued for another 10 years, it would have been the complete teaching package, rounded out. The pension would have made sense, the all the bells and whistles. And by the way, this is my story. I'm not giving anybody advice. I'm simply sharing what happened with me.
Yeah.
And I knew that that wasn't going to be the way. It was coming in my, like it was coming through my bones. And they were so gracious. And I left and I went into 5 months of drafting. And it was like, this little kid in me was like, yes, we get to work. I worked with an editor who, just was so kick-ass. The first time I got the manuscript back, honest to God, I had to just lie on the couch and lick my wounds. It was like, oh my God, is she speaking to me sarcastically? It's like, is she, I was trying to read her tone through and she had tone, believe me. Like I was going through the whole thing and I felt pummeled, and it was, it was like the best thing, because I realized, wait a minute, no, she's helping me. She's helping me.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm coming to your house. I brought the book with all the handwriting, and we're doing this thing, and I just had this amazing 6-month experience with her. We met all the deadlines. I signed off, I delivered it right on schedule. Actually, it was the very end of the year. And the agent loved it. And she sent it out again. And Louise, it was rejected everywhere it was sent. And this was after I had made the job change, i.e. did not have a job.
Right.
And that was when things got really interesting. And that was when I was absolutely on the inside of a coaching process. It was so important for me to be working with a coach.
Yeah.
And I was learning the very skills that I did not have when I was 20 and 22. Right. So I always say that when you have a passion, work with your craft teachers, work with your skills teachers, your industry specific people, and work with somebody who can help you with that spiritual muscle, because that piece is so integral to all of it. And I'm very happy to say that I worked with Mary Morrissey, and I discovered in the process of being on the receiving end that I loved it so much that I wanted to be a coach. But that came later. When the rejections came with the book, well, you'll appreciate this, Louise, you have a coach's heart. So again, I'm speaking your language. I know I am.
Absolutely.
When I went up to the study one day after that manuscript had been rejected yet again, and I mean, I could just feel like, oh my God, the whole model of how I had envisioned it working with this wonderful agent, with, whatever house it was. I mean, we had a short list. The whole publishing industry at that point had been, doing its flips and trying to adjust to this new world, right?
Right.
And I made a decision again, and this is what I want to bring home to listeners. I made a decision again that I was not giving up on this. I had come too far to give up on this. And so again, it was a yes. It was a yes. I did not know how. It was sad. It was scary. And when I kept saying yes, other little messages started coming through. And as usual, I had my journal open and I would write them down. And then, I remember looking and saying, what is this? I'm writing about birds. I'm writing a poem. What is this? I haven't written a poem in 10 years. Why am I writing a poem? And it turned out that it was a whole other book. It was another book that when I said yes to this book, this book came through.
Wow.
And this book came through from messy handwriting on a page to Amazon.
And you're talking about Bird Light now. So those who are listening to us on the radio or on the podcast, this second book we're talking about is Bird Light.
Yes. Yeah,
Wow.
I did not see that book coming. I had no idea. It was an 18-month process from handwriting to Amazon bestseller. And I mean, my goodness, I say that humbly because I often was just showing up and stuff was coming through me. I was connecting with people. And again, I put people around me to support that process. None of these projects, you know, when you look at somebody who's written a book, it looks like they've done it all on their own. They haven't.
You know what, Robin?
I think do this alone.
It's anyone who is successful in life. No one gets there alone. It's easy for us to look at, I think if we look at even in let's just look at Hollywood, for instance. There will be people, they don't get there alone. When we see people accepting their Oscars or Academy Awards, they've got a long list of people that they thank.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we look at successful people at any layer in society, no one gets where they get to alone.
No.
And so I find that interesting, and I always love to hear about the people who have supported you along the way, because I think it comes in many forms, not just, like you said, it's editors, it's other, I mean, I can't imagine the list of people, but it's also family and friends.
Mm-hmm.
Certain people, you mentioned that there was someone who for a long time, there was only one person whose eyes crossed your words.
Oh my God, yes.
People along this whole journey are invaluable in terms of how they continue to help a project come to fruition. Mm-hmm. And I love how you talk so openly about these setbacks that you got, and that it's really clear to me that your dreams were bigger than your fears. Mm-hmm. Your dreams are bigger than your fears, and they have to be for you to persevere.
Yes. And when we do begin to really build muscle in dream building, we recognize that fear is a healthy part of it. Fear, and always with fear, we want to ask, is this a fear that when I think about, I think about completing this task, is it a fear that I know that if I step into it, if I step through it, if I take action, it's going to feel expansive? That's my litmus test. If it feels expansive, even before coming on to this interview with you today, of course, there's a voice in me that's freaking out, and that's so, it's just what happens. Every time I get up and speak in front of an audience, there's a part of me that, the introverted part of me that would love to be cozy and sitting in bed and reading my books and writing in my journal. Well, no, that isn't how, it would be a waste we just wouldn't get there if we were not connecting, right? So, and
you wouldn't be sharing your message. You wouldn't be fulfilling your purpose and your larger why.
No, and this is why when I see young people who are very uber talented and passionate and just full of tons of potential, when I see people walling themselves off and laboring and becoming frustrated, I just know that there are ways that each one of us, when we're in a situation like that, we can learn to work with the ways this universe works. And that's what I had to learn to do. It doesn't matter what stage of life you learn it. Creativity is ageless. That's one of the things that I really emphasize in this book. I mean, chapter 1 of this book, by the way, is all about navigating rejection.
Wow.
That was the key. Understanding, wow, this isn't an affliction. This is an invitation to qualify. This is like, you get to qualify, Robin. Just, step up and receive your prize. And what is the prize? The prize is understanding that you and I can make anything we set our hearts on. We can bring that into form. It doesn't always happen the way that we think it should. And that's why I will always say when someone comes to work with me, focus on the what. What is it that you would love? Not the how, because you are a dance partner with this universe. The universe is going to dazzle you when you stay focused on your what. There are things that have happened in my life in the last 5 years I could never have predicted. I wouldn't have predicted that I would be living here
Yeah.
in the same, the same community as you. I mean, I had lived in Toronto my whole life. It's only very recently that I've come to the Ottawa area.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting when you can be open to receive. Right?
mhm.
Trust. I really believe that when you trust your dream and take action in towards that, but be open to the how, that's when the magic happens and doors become suddenly open for you or appear
Mhm.
that you would never have otherwise noticed. So that was how I lived my life until I was about 40. And I was very focused, very determined on the what, but I was also, in hindsight now, I recognize that I was also far too focused on the how. And I think there were people standing behind doors, arms flailing, saying, hello, look over here, look over here. Something really even more awesome over here that's actually going to get you to an even better place. And I was just too, I was too focused. And so lesson learned, no regrets as far as that's concerned. You mentioned that you have a beautiful daughter from your first marriage, and I too have got 3 boys from mine. So, it all gets us to where we are today. But that open to receive is not something that I really understood what that even meant.
Mhm.
So what I'd like to ask you is, so listeners right now who may have resonated, what you said may have resonated with them about, being at this stage now where you're kind of ready to receive. What do they do now? What's the first step that they should take in recognizing that I've been trying to do this all alone? I don't know, but I don't know what's the first step. What would you, without being able to speak directly to them and have a dialogue, what could you share with them as advice?
Well, I always ask that people simply ask themselves the question, what would I love? What would I love if I could remove the circumstances of my life from the table? What would I love? Because to me, this connects us with, this is a very deep question. We quickly run through the things that are kind of superficial, and we get to the core with that question. And the more willing we are to answer the question, the more connected we become. The more connected we become with our own sense of calling. Working with someone who honors you in being aligned is so key. And so I would say to anyone, find a coach. Find a coach who you click with, who gets you. I mean, nobody's going to get you more than you. You're the highest authority on you, but find somebody who would love to support you in taking that next step. And of course, I think at the end, you'll share some information about me. But, it's important to find a good fit. It's important to find someone you work with who really feels like a great fit with you.
Well, I answered that question intentionally right now, Robin, because I wanted to ask you, so if someone now is sensing, you know what, I think this Robin woman sounds really interesting, and I'd like to explore the possibility of Robin.
Mm-hmm.
How would they reach you?
Well, an easy next step is if that person is in the Ottawa area, I actually am going to be giving a workshop this Sunday. And so that is my vision workshop, 3 keys to manifesting your heart's desire. And there's lots of detail I can send on that. Simply email me, Robin, ROBIN, like the bird, Robin at robinblackburnmcbride.com is a really super easy way of connecting with me. And I will say, even though I am going into book launch season, we're having launches in 3 cities for The Shining Fragments, which of course did find its publishing home in a way that I did not see, in a way that absolutely came out of the coaching work that I was on the receiving end of. Even though all of that is happening, I am coaching. I am coaching in my week, and connecting with people who are interested is part of my passion, part of my calling. I mean, that is what happens when we move up a mountain. We start to see things from a higher vantage point. And what I saw in my process was I loved being on the receiving end so much that I I wanted to give this to people, which of course is a form of teaching that I never would have seen had I stayed within the institutional framework that I had been in. And so, yes, just short answer, email me. And check out my website. And you may wish to also, you may wish to get a copy of Birdlight. It's easy to find through my website, Amazon.
And what about the book that's being launched right now?
The Shining Fragments. Yeah.
Where can we get our hands on a copy of that?
There are various launch events in Toronto at Ben McNally on October 10th, in Ottawa at the Art House Cafe on October 17th, in Montreal at Paragraph on October 24th. So those are live events. I've also got a couple of, again, on my site, you'll see on my events page, there are a number of events listed in Toronto that are live events, because it is historical. It does take place in the city of Toronto at the end of the 19th century, early 20th. And so live events, one way. Another way is just simply order it on Amazon. It's available now for pre-order. I believe it goes on sale on October 1st.
Fantastic. I'm so motivated and inspired by your story, and I know that other listeners will be as well. So who has been, or what has inspired you to carry on and pursue this dream and this thing of yours that you've just not been able to shake?
Do you mean specifically this book?
Yeah. Or
It's been a really interesting process because, and it has required soul force because in fact the book was largely finished by very early in 2014. So that was several years ago. I mean, obviously in the last 6 months, we've gone back in, we've dotted some I's and crossed some T's, but it was mostly completed. I'm going to answer that question. There are a number of ways I could go in my answer. I'm going to choose one that I think would be relevant to your listeners. I had to re-enter the book. I had to be willing. Part of me was afraid to go back into it because when the publisher said yes, he said yes. And I, by the way, want to mention the publisher, Guernica Editions, Michael Marola at Guernica Editions, an angel. When he said yes, the caveat was, but it will be several years. And at first I didn't want to hear that, but actually it made perfect, again, hindsight 2020, it made perfect sense because I had no idea I would be moving. I had no idea that a number of things were going to be happening in my life. And in fact, it's been the perfect timing, but because years have passed, I was actually afraid to go back into the book. My doubt started creeping in again. And what really got me through was connecting with my characters again. They're all like my children. It was going back in and trusting the story. It's a story about an abandoned person who is little when that happens. And so, yes, on the one hand, we could call it historical fiction. We could talk about the Irish in Canada. We could frame it in a number of different ways. In essence, it's about a young person feeling alone. And I was thinking before this interview today, how for me, that's been my calling card throughout this whole process of writing this book, was looking at that, loving into that in honoring him and in honoring his story and his trials and tribulations, his imperfection. He is not a perfect person. He is very much an imperfect person. In honoring that, it's been a process of honoring the journey of bringing that to light. And
Robin, I would love to explore this more, but we have 30 seconds to wrap this up.
Awesome.
I know, I do apologize for cutting you off. I need to say, before we do close,
Yeah.
a huge, beautiful thank you to you and all that you have shared. Listeners, I encourage you to check out Robin's work, and I know I'll be on Amazon to get her book following the show. So thank you, Robin.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. And as I always do, I'd love to share my love and gratitude to all of my loyal listeners, as well as my producer at Contact Talk Radio, Cameron Steele. And I'm finally here to shine the light and showcase people who are taking brave, bold action in pursuit of their dreams and goals. May that be you this week. Goodbye, my friends, and see you all next Tuesday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Okay, you're clear.
Thank you, Cameron.
All right, my dear. Thank you. All right, you guys
Thank you
continue.
very
I'll
much.
just,
Yep, thank you so much. We'll chat